benefit they get from the national insurance. But this does not include, of course, the loss of income they have because they have to spend a lot of time caring for the children. And this part of loss of income, which has a meaning for the parents and for the economy in general, for the state, is usually not, because these are indirect costs, they usually do not, they are not quantified in most of the studies, including most of the studies from the United States and other places, and it's really harder to quantify them. So this is what we try to do in this study. It's also complicated because we know that children with autism come from families that have different socioeconomic status in general in Israel. And you can see part of this in this recent publication. So in general, as already we talked about it today in several presentations here, Israeli Arabs and ultra-Orthodox Jews have lower incidence or reported incidence rates in Israel. And even within each of these groups, if you have higher income, then the chances that the child will be diagnosed with autism are higher. So if you want to talk about wage or income loss, you have to overcome these differences among the populations. So this is quite a challenging task. It needs a large-scale data to overcome the big variance in the population, a reliable source of income data. For example, if you ask a parent about their income, it's not very reliable. It's one of the more problematic variables to get reliable data on. Volunteers may cause selection bias, of course. And when you think about income or wage loss, you have to think how do you define it, and relative to what, and relative to whom, and how to cancel the baseline income differences among the families. And also, is it specific for autism or general to developmental disabilities? So the main open questions that we had in mind when we started to look at these things are, first thing, how does the birth of a child with developmental disability affect parental work and wage? How many of the parents remain in the workforce? And do those who remain at work have decreased wage? Is it different between mothers and fathers? Is it different between parents of children with autism and hearing loss? Hearing loss is the second group that we used in the study. And is it different from the effect of birth of a child with typical development, which is the third group that we used in the study? And is the effect limited to the first years? Let's say after age 2 or 3, maybe the effect is not there anymore. Our settings, the data source is the National Insurance Institute of Israel. It has national coverage, child disability benefit due to ASD, regardless of anything, actually. You just have to come with proper diagnosis. Income data from official records, so it's not any kind of self-reporting or survey or something like that, because the National Insurance knows, they have the wage data from the tax authorities. So of course, if you hide your wage from the state, they don't know about it, but anything else they do. These are longitudinal data, so for each parent, for each family, you have their salary or wage for each year and each month for a long time. The study population are the children who were born in Israel between 2005 and 2010. All of those were identified in the national insurance with either autism or hearing loss, and these are the numbers. And a random 20% sample of the children born during the same years in Israel with no child disability allowance for any reason. So these are sort of control group. Oh, that's weird. Okay. Some definitions, the time period we looked at were starting from 4 years before birth of the relevant child up to age 5. We excluded the year of birth because, of course, after birth, many parents go to maternity leaves, of course, mothers, but also sometimes fathers. So these are expected differences. So we didn't look at what happens in that year. The first thing we looked at is annual work status, so whether you have a wage from any source in a given year. And then if you do, what is the level of your wage, and also what is the annual household wage, just the sum of the father and the mother. Some descriptive statistics will follow, and we did also 2 analytic models. One is to look at the risk of loss of work. Loss of work means that you have been working 2 years before the birth of the child, and then you stopped working, or you do not have any wage in a specific year after the birth. This is done among, as I said, mothers and fathers who worked during 2 years before the birth. It cancels the baseline differences in workforce participation because this analysis only looks at those who did work. And each model is comparing either ASD or hearing loss to typical development children. And the models are adjusted for year of birth, population group, parental ages, education, birth order, and periphery scores. We had some more data that we didn't see any impact of these variables, so we didn't include them in the analysis. The second analysis is about the relative household wage. So if you work, let's say that you didn't lose your job, or you do have an income after birth, okay? What is the level of your income relative to the income you had before? This includes only households who had wage during the 2 years before birth, and both parents remained in the workforce after birth. So they didn't lose their job or their income, but let's see how much they earn now. So this cancels the baseline differences in household wage among the groups, the same like before. Okay, some results. These are descriptives of the study population. I will not go into it because of the short time we have today. Right, some descriptive statistics about workforce participation rates, and let's start with the fathers. So on the x-axis, what you have here is the year relative to birth. So -4 is 4 years before the birth of the relevant child that we're looking at. Okay, so we're looking at whether or how many of the fathers have a wage or have some kind of income from work. Okay, in a specific year, and we have the 3 groups here. So let's start with the black bars, which are the fathers who will later have a child who is typically developing. Okay, so they have something like almost 70%. Almost 70% of them are in the workforce. Okay, the hearing loss are the right bars, the light gray. A bit less, and the parents who will later have children of autism are actually participating more in the workforce. This is explained by the known fact that those children come from higher SES families. Okay, so you can see it quite consistent over the years before birth, and then there's the year of birth that we didn't show, and then we start from age 1, 2, 3, and 4. So this is like the 5th year of life, the most right bars. And you don't see much differences before and after birth, right? You don't see much differences. Believe me that I've been looking at this very closely in all kinds of measures, and in general you don't see a lot of impact, or you don't see any significant impact on fathers' participation in the workforce in any of those groups. Okay, so these are the fathers, right? And these are the mothers. So let's start from what happens in mothers before birth. Okay, so mothers in general, women in general, participate less in the workforce in Israel. So they go to about the typically developing, those who will have typically developing children, or something like 60% participation rate, so something like 10% less than the men. And the differences between the groups are higher than what you saw in the fathers. You can see, for example, how large is the difference between the mothers of hearing loss children and the mothers of TD children. So this again represents the fact that hearing loss children will come from lower SES groups. Okay? And this is quite consistent, let's say, until birth. And then, of course, you can see a very large effect of the birth of any child. You can see it you can also see it in the typically developing families or mothers. Okay, so these are mothers. The black bars are mothers of TD children. You can see a decrease of something like, let's say, 3 or 4%, and then they recover. Okay, so eventually, when the children are 4, you can see that their participation rate is even a bit higher than what it was before birth. So most of let's say, all of the mothers, this is not individual measures, but in general, a higher percentage of mothers of TD children will be working or will have some kind of income from work 4 years after birth. Okay. Then, when you look at autism, you can see a much larger effect of decrease in workforce participation after birth. And you can also see that this effect is not recovering. So they do not go back to the level they were. They lose something like 5% of the mothers who were working will not work even when the child is 5 years old. Okay? And the hearing loss, the mothers of hearing loss children will recover. They do recover. So this is the first thing that is unique to the mothers of ST children. And then let's try to quantify the risk of not coming back to work in an analytic model. So this is now adjusted for all baseline differences of those families. And these are the fathers. You don't see any differences here, any significant differences, not in autism, not in hearing loss. So they're not in increased risk. But when you go to the mothers again, so this is not descriptive statistics that I showed you before, but an analytic model that is adjusting for the fact that they come from different backgrounds. And you can see that mothers of children with autism they have something like 30% additional risk of not going back to the workforce in the second year of life, okay, when the child is 1 year old, and this continues. This association does not. It doesn't go anywhere. It stays even until age of 5 years old, and we didn't have enough data to go beyond that, unfortunately. And this is also true, even though the association is a bit weaker, this is also true for the hearing loss. Mothers of children with hearing loss, they also have higher risk of not going back to the workforce in comparison to the risk of mothers of typically developing children. All right. Now for the household wage. So if you did come back to work, if you're working, what is the impact of birth of a child with ASD or hearing loss on the total household wage? Is there a difference? So again, we have models here that are comparing ASD or hearing loss to the typically developing children. And you can see, so this is the effect in the second year of life on parents of children with ASD, and even if you go here to, again, age 4 to 5 years old, you can see that even if you go back to the workforce, you have decreased wage. Okay, you can see it also in hearing loss. In hearing loss, you can see actually here you can see a larger effect. So, less mothers but not fathers of children with autism go back to work after birth. In those who do go back, household wage is following a decreased trajectory in both ASD and hearing loss relative to families of TD children. These additional hidden economic effects of developmental disabilities and families and on the states, that these are commonly ignored in the literature. That's it.